I never believed in ghosts, or curses, or ancient runes holding some kind of forbidden knowledge. That kind of stuff was for horror movies, urban legends, and overactive imaginations. At least, that's what I thought, before I found myself standing inside the dimly lit archive of an abandoned university library, alone, with nothing but the weight of an unshakable presence pressing against my chest. I didn't end up there by accident. My best friend Dylan was obsessed with old books and historical oddities. And when he found out about an underground section of the Holloway University Library, a path that had been sealed off for decades, he was determined to see it for himself. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but when he showed me an old yellowed article from 1974 about a student who vanished after deciphering something he was never meant to read, I was intrigued. The library itself had been standing since the late 1800s, its Gothic architecture towering over the rest of the campus like a shrine to forgotten knowledge. It smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, something faint but sickly sweet, like the scent of dried flowers left too long in a graveyard. We bribed one of the janitors, an old man named Carl, who warned us before handing over the key. "You kids don't want to go down there," he muttered, his voice rough with age. "People say things whisper in the dark. That place ain't right." Dylan laughed it off. I forced a smile. But when we pushed open the heavy wooden door that led to the underground archive, my stomach twisted with unease. The basement was freezing, far colder than it should have been. Our flashlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating rows of forgotten shelves stacked with books that hadn't been touched in decades. Some were bound in leather so old it cracked like dead skin. Others wrapped in cloth that reeked of rot. But one book stood out. A massive black tome resting on a pedestal in the center of the room, almost like it had been waiting for us. The cover was smooth, impossibly well preserved compared to the others, and etched into the front was a series of strange symbols, runes, but unlike any I'd ever seen before. They twisted in on themselves, shifting slightly in the dim light, as if alive. That's when I heard it. A voice. No, not a voice. A whisper. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I recognized. But it was there, curling around my thoughts like cold fingers. And the moment Dylan reached out to touch the book, the whisper turned into a scream. Dylan yanked his hand back as if the book had burned him. The scream we heard, it wasn't something from inside the library. It was inside our heads. Sharp, piercing, like 100 voices crying out at once before cutting off so suddenly that the silence felt even louder. We stood frozen, our flashlight beams shaking slightly as we stared at the book. The runes seemed different, as if they had rearranged themselves while we weren't looking. Dylan cursed under his breath. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, but that doesn't make sense. It was just probably in our heads. Maybe we spooked ourselves." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I turned to look at the shelves surrounding us, I realized something chilling. The books. They weren't covered in dust anymore. When we first walked in, everything had been blanketed in thick layers of age and neglect. But now, the dust was gone, as if something, or someone, had just been here. The air was growing heavier, thick with an almost metallic scent, like old blood. I tried to push down the unease, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave. Now Dylan, however, was still focused on the book. "We should take a picture of these runes," he said, pulling out his phone. "Are you serious?" I hissed. "Did you not just hear that scream?" "Something isn't right, Dylan. We need to get out of here." But before I could stop him, he snapped a photo. The moment his camera clicked, the lights flickered violently, buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry insects. My heart lurched into my throat as the overhead bulbs popped, one by one, plunging us into near total darkness. Then the whispering returned. But this time, it was all around us. The sound slithered through the bookshelves, curling through the air like invisible tendrils. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent behind them was unmistakable. We were not welcome here. Dylan grabbed my arm. His voice was shaking. "Okay, let's go." We turned to run, but the doorway wasn't there anymore. I mean, it was, but somehow it wasn't. The hallway we had walked through to get here now stretched on endlessly, bookshelves lining the path in either direction. My breath hitched. That wasn't possible. We had walked through a single corridor. There was only one way, in and out. Dylan's flashlight flickered and died. No, not now," he muttered, smacking it against his palm. I lifted mine higher, desperately trying to find a sign. Anything that would tell me which way to go. But then, I noticed something. The runes on the book. They were glowing. A deep, pulsing red, like embers in a dying fire. And as the light grew brighter, so did the whispers, rising into a maddening, chaotic chorus of voices. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to stop the sound. Dylan staggered back, gripping his head. Then the books began to move. Not just fall, move. They slid from the shelves, pages fluttering wildly as if caught in an unseen wind. Some slammed against the floor, others hovered in midair, their covers flipping open and shut in rapid succession. A low, guttural sound echoed from deep within the archive, a sound that did not belong to any human. Something else was here, and it was waking up. I don't remember screaming, but my throat was burning. Maybe I had. Maybe the sound was swallowed by the deafening chaos around us. Books slamming against the walls, pages ripping themselves apart, and the whispers. Oh God, the whispers had turned into laughter. Not human laughter. It was hollow, fragmented, like voices trapped in an ancient radio transmission, cutting in and out of reality, mocking us. Dylan grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. "We need to run. Now." "Where?" I yelled back, barely able to hear myself over the cacophony. The exit was gone, replaced by an endless corridor of bookshelves that seemed to shift and breathe as if the library itself was alive. Then, the lights, what was left of them, went out completely. We were plunged into absolute darkness. For a split second, everything stopped. The books, the whispers, the sound of our panicked breathing. And then, from the depths of that silence, it spoke. Not a whisper this time. Not fragmented voices, but one deep, guttural voice that came from every direction at once. "You read what was never meant to be read." My body went ice cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voice wasn't coming from something human. It was old, far older than this library. Older than the stones that built it. Older than the language it had spoken. Then something shifted in the darkness. A shadow taller than the shelves loomed just ahead of us. My flashlight, dim and flickering, barely illuminated its form, but I saw enough. It wasn't a man. It was twisted, its limbs too long, its fingers curling like skeletal branches. Its head was featureless except for a mouth, an impossibly wide grin that stretched from where its eyes should have been all the way down to its neck. The runes on the book behind us flared violently, and the thing screeched. It lunged. Dylan yanked me backward just as the bookshelf collapsed where we had been standing. Dust and paper exploded around us as we sprinted in the only direction we could, forward. Except the corridor wasn't ending. The library was rearranging itself, extending the halls infinitely, trapping us inside a labyrinth that shouldn't exist. I heard Dylan stumble behind me, his breath ragged. It's playing with us," he gasped. "We're never getting out." "Shut up! Don't say that!" I shouted back, my lungs burning as I forced myself to run faster. Then something clicked in my head. The book, the runes, that scream when Dylan had touched it. We had triggered something, and if opening the book had awakened it, then maybe closing it could stop it. "Dylan!" The book. A bony claw-like hand slammed against my shoulder. I went flying, crashing into a bookshelf with enough force to knock the breath from my lungs. My vision blurred. Dylan screamed my name, but it was distant, drowned out by the sound of books hitting the floor, of something dragging itself closer. I forced myself up, gasping, and turned just in time to see Dylan sprinting back toward the pedestal. He was going for the book. "Hold it off!" he yelled. I didn't know how to fight something like this, but I had no choice. I grabbed the nearest heavy book and hurled it toward the thing's grinning face. It didn't flinch. Instead, its mouth twisted wider, and a chorus of voices spilled out, overlapping in a distorted mess of languages. "You cannot unsee what you have seen." Dylan reached the pedestal. His hands slammed against the book's cover, trying to force it shut. The moment his fingers pressed against the runes, the entire library shook. The air around us seemed to tear, like fabric being ripped apart. The shadows howled, and then silence. The whispers stopped. The laughter died. I turned. The creature was gone. The books lay still. The library was normal, dusty, decayed, just like when we had first entered. Dylan's hands were trembling against the closed cover of the book. His face was pale, drenched in sweat. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. Then, from the far end of the room, where the hallway had been missing before, came a quiet creak. We turned. The exit was back. Neither of us spoke as we stood there, staring at the doorway that had miraculously reappeared. The oppressive weight of the air had lifted, but a deep, unsettling chill remained. It felt like the library was watching us. Dylan swallowed hard. "We're leaving. Right now." I nodded. We didn't run this time. We walked slow, careful steps, as if any sudden movement would wake it back up. The hallway stretched ahead just like before, but something felt different. The flickering light above cast longer shadows than it should have. The books on the shelves were back in place, but now I had the unsettling feeling that they were listening. As we reached the entrance, Dylan hesitated. "The book," he muttered. "What do we do with it?" I turned back, staring at the pedestal where it sat. Its dark cover now closed and still. The runes weren't glowing anymore, but somehow I knew they weren't gone. "We don't touch it," I said firmly. "Ever." Dylan gave a shaky nod, and without another word, we pushed through the heavy wooden doors, stepping out into the night air. The moment we crossed the threshold, it felt like something released us. I hadn't even realized I was holding my breath until I finally exhaled. The cool breeze hitting my face like I had just surfaced from drowning. We turned back toward the library. It stood there, silent and unmoving, just as it had for decades. A relic of the past, a tomb of forgotten knowledge, a prison for whatever was inside. Dylan shook his head. We're never talking about this again. I wanted to agree. I should have agreed. But as I stared at the darkened windows, something gnawed at me. That thing. It spoke to us. It knew us. And the runes. I pulled out my phone, heart hammering. I scrolled to the picture Dylan had taken of the book's runes before everything had gone to hell. The image wasn't there. I blinked, scrolled again. Nothing. Just a black void where the picture should have been. And then my screen flickered. For a split second, I saw words appear. Not English, not any language I recognized. But I understood the message anyway. It is not over. The screen glitched and returned to normal. The picture was completely gone. I turned to Dylan, my mouth dry. We need to go. And without another word, we left, never looking back. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that we never really escaped. That something from that library followed us. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers.